In 1974, Chrysler still had a weapon under the hood that looked almost impossible to kill, a 440 cubic inch big block V8. 440 cubic inches of cast iron, a 4.32-inch bore, a 3.75-inch stroke, 8 cylinders built for one simple purpose: move a very heavy American car with authority. This wasn't some small displacement economy engine pretending to be powerful. This was a genuine big block, the kind of engine that made other manufacturers nervous, the kind that could pull a full-size luxury car from a stoplight like it weighed nothing, the kind that defined what American automotive muscle was supposed to feel like. But something had changed. The golden age of muscle was collapsing. Emissions regulations were tightening, fuel prices were exploding, compression ratios were falling, and the engines that had once been measured by horsepower were suddenly being judged by tailpipe emissions and fuel economy. The 440 was caught directly in the middle. And here's where the story gets interesting, because the title you've just heard contains a technical twist that most people miss. The 1974 440 itself was not Chrysler's electronic lean burn engine. Chrysler introduced the electronic lean burn system for the 1976 model year, and the technology reached the 440 in later applications. But 1974 was a crucial moment in the story because it shows exactly what Chrysler was trying to save as the old muscle car formula disappeared. And what happened to the 440 afterward would become one of the strangest chapters in Mopar history, because Chrysler didn't destroy the 440 with one bad engine design. It slowly strangled a legend with emissions equipment, lower compression, altered calibration, and eventually electronics that were supposed to make everything better. Most people remember the lean burn system as a joke. The real story is much more complicated and much more fascinating. To understand why Chrysler went there, you have to go back to the beginning of the 1970s. Just a few years earlier, the 440 had been one of the most intimidating engines in Detroit. In high-performance form, the 440 could produce 375 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. Some versions used higher compression and aggressive camshaft profiles. The engine had enormous displacement and a reputation for making effortless torque. It was the engine you ordered when you wanted people to know you were serious, when you wanted a Charger that could embarrass smaller cars, when you wanted a Chrysler New Yorker that could cruise at highway speeds without breaking a sweat. The 440 was versatility and violence wrapped in cast iron. Then the rules changed. The Clean Air Act had pushed Detroit toward dramatically cleaner engines. Leaded fuel was disappearing. Compression ratios were being reduced. Manufacturers were trying to control hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen oxides without completely destroying drivability. And Chrysler had another problem. Its cars were huge. A 1974 full-size Chrysler could weigh well over 2 tons. You weren't putting a little 4-cylinder into a lightweight economy car. You were asking a giant V8 to haul a living room down the highway while meeting increasingly strict emissions standards. So Chrysler kept the 440 alive, but the engine you got in 1974 was already a very different animal from the monster that had terrorized the streets a few years earlier. The basic architecture was still beautiful. The bore remained 4.32 inches. The stroke was 3.75 inches. Displacement was still 440 cubic inches, or about 7.2 liters. But compression had fallen dramatically, around 8.2 to 1. That's a massive change when you compare it with the high-compression 440S of the muscle car era. Some earlier versions had been running compression ratios above 10.0 to 1. Now you were looking at barely over 8. That difference matters more than most people realize, because compression ratio directly affects how much cylinder pressure you create during combustion. And cylinder pressure is what creates torque. Lower compression means less pressure means less torque means the engine feels lazier. And when you're trying to move a 2-ton Chrysler, lazy is exactly what you don't want. And horsepower had fallen with it. Depending on configuration, 1974 440S were rated around 220 horsepower in standard 4-barrel form, while higher output versions were rated around 275 horsepower and approximately 380 pound-feet of torque. Think about that for a second. The same basic 440 architecture that had once been capable of producing enormous power was now being asked to survive in a world where emissions mattered more than quarter-mile times. And Chrysler wasn't finished. Not even close, because the engineers were about to try something that sounded brilliant on paper. If you could control ignition timing precisely enough, you could make a leaner mixture burn properly. A lean mixture means more air relative to fuel. That can reduce certain emissions and improve efficiency, but there's a catch. A lean mixture is harder to ignite and easier to make unstable. Running too lean can cause hesitation. It can cause detonation. It can cause poor throttle response. It can make an engine feel unresponsive exactly when the driver wants power. So Chrysler needed a way to control spark timing far more precisely than a traditional mechanical distributor could. And that's where electronics entered the story. The basic idea was surprisingly advanced for the mid-1970s. Instead of relying entirely on mechanical and vacuum advanced mechanisms, Chrysler's electronic spark advanced system could monitor multiple engine conditions and adjust ignition timing accordingly. Engine speed, manifold vacuum, throttle position, throttle movement, coolant temperature, intake air temperature, and other operating conditions. All of those signals could be processed by an electronic spark control computer, which would then advance or retard the ignition timing. In other words, Chrysler was beginning to make the engine think. That was a huge engineering step, but it also created a huge new weakness, because now the engine wasn't just mechanical. It depended on electronics, and electronics were entering automotive engines at a time when the industry was still learning how to make them survive under a hood. Heat, vibration, moisture, voltage spikes, oil, dust, thousands of miles of temperature cycles. The engine bay was not exactly a friendly environment for a delicate electronic control system. You could build a carburetor that would survive almost anything. You could build a distributor that would run for hundreds of thousands of miles. But a computer? That was a different kind of gamble. And Chrysler knew the stakes. The company was trying to accomplish something that had never really been done at this scale. Take a giant carbureted V8. Make it run cleaner, make it run leaner, control its ignition electronically, and still make the car acceptable to ordinary customers. That sounds simple until you realize what happens when one part of the system isn't happy. A lean engine can stumble. Incorrect timing can create poor throttle response. A bad sensor signal can cause the computer to make the wrong decision. And when that computer is controlling the ignition timing of a 440, the consequences aren't theoretical. The engine can feel lazy, it can surge, it can hesitate, it can run poorly, it can leave an owner sitting at a stoplight, wondering why their expensive Chrysler feels weaker than it should. And suddenly, the owner isn't thinking about emissions technology. He's thinking about why his enormous V8 feels weaker than it should. But here's the part that makes the story even stranger. Chrysler's lean burn system wasn't simply a random attempt to cripple the 440. It was actually an ambitious engineering solution. Contemporary technical material described the system as a way to control combustion and emissions electronically. Chrysler engineers believed electronic spark control could provide meaningful improvements in performance and fuel economy compared with some contemporary emission control approaches. On paper, that sounds like a win. Cleaner emissions, better fuel economy, electronic precision, less dependence on traditional mechanical timing, a modern solution to a modern problem. So why did the system become so controversial? Because reality doesn't care how good the engineering looks on a drawing board. The first lean burn systems appeared for the 1976 model year. Chrysler initially concentrated the technology on larger engines. EPA documentation specifically identifies 76 Chrysler models using the ESA lean burn system, and notes that the electronic spark advance portion was particularly important to the system's operation. And eventually, the 440 got pulled deeper into this new electronic world. By then, the big block was fighting a completely different war. The old 440 had been designed around performance. Now it was being asked to prioritize emissions, fuel economy, and drivability. The hardware was still enormous, but the personality was changing. The low compression was one part of the problem. At 8.2 to 1, the engine simply didn't have the same cylinder pressure as its high compression ancestors. And that matters. Cylinder pressure is one of the foundations of torque and power. You can still make a big engine work with low compression, but if you're trying to create the same violent response that made a high compression muscle car engine famous, you're starting with a handicap. Then came emissions hardware, then altered carburetor calibration, then EGR strategies, then ignition control. Piece by piece, the engine was being optimized for a world that no longer rewarded brute force. And there was another enemy nobody at Chrysler could control: fuel. The 1973 oil crisis sent gasoline prices upward and created enormous pressure on manufacturers to improve fuel economy. Buyers were waiting in line just to fill their tanks. Gas stations were running dry. The idea of buying a car with a 7.2-liter V8 suddenly seemed irresponsible to many Americans. The American buyer who once wanted the biggest engine possible was suddenly thinking about what it cost to fill the tank. The era had changed, and the 440 was trapped between two worlds. But the lean burn system had one final problem: reliability. The concept depended on an electronic control module and several inputs working correctly. Chrysler's own later development work shows just how sophisticated the system became, with the spark control computer processing information from multiple sensors to determine ignition timing. Today, that sounds ordinary. In the 1970s, it was revolutionary, and revolutionary doesn't always mean ready. When the system worked correctly, the computer could make decisions a mechanical distributor simply couldn't. It could optimize timing under conditions that would confuse a simple vacuum advance canister. It could respond to throttle changes faster than springs and weights. It could theoretically extract better performance and efficiency from a compromised engine design. But when something went wrong, diagnosing the problem could be far more complicated. A traditional ignition system could be inspected. A mechanic could check points, check timing, check vacuum advance, check the distributor, pull the cap, look at the rotor, test the coil. Simple tools, simple diagnostics. The new system introduced another layer: electronics, sensors, control modules, wiring, connections. Suddenly, the mechanic wasn't just fixing an engine, he was troubleshooting a computer-controlled combustion system. And that was happening before automotive diagnostics had become the standardized science we take for granted today. There were no OBD2 scanners, no standardized trouble codes, no easy plug-in diagnostics. Just a mechanic trying to figure out whether the problem was mechanical, electrical, or electronic. This is why the 440 lean burn story is so often misunderstood. People say Chrysler ruined the engine, but the deeper truth is that Chrysler was trying to make an obsolete formula survive. A huge 7.2-liter V8, a carburetor, a heavy automobile, strict emissions regulations, rising fuel prices, and customers who still expected a Chrysler to feel like a Chrysler. That combination was almost impossible, and the numbers tell the story. An EPA evaluation of a Chrysler 440 lean burn vehicle recorded a 440 with the familiar 4.32 by 3.75-inch bore and stroke and an 8.2 to 1 compression ratio. The tested engine was estimated at 215 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. The test car returned 11.0 mpg combined, compared with 12.5 mpg for the corresponding Chrysler certification 440 in that comparison. That number is revealing. The system wasn't some magical fuel-saving revolution. At least in that tested configuration, it didn't suddenly transform a giant Chrysler into an economy car. It was a compromise, a very complicated compromise. And here's the irony: Chrysler was actually ahead of its time. Electronic engine management would eventually become the foundation of modern automotive technology. Today, an engine constantly adjusts fuel delivery and ignition timing using sensor data. Modern computers make thousands of decisions. Every second, they monitor oxygen levels, They adjust fuel trims. They control variable valve timing. They manage direct injection. They handle boost control on turbocharged engines. Fuel injection replaced carburetors. Distributorless ignition replaced mechanical distributors. Closed-loop feedback became normal. The basic philosophy Chrysler was experimenting with was pointing toward the future. The problem wasn't the idea. The problem was the era. The hardware wasn't mature enough. The calibration wasn't always perfect. And the customers weren't buying a computer. They were buying a car. They wanted it to start. They wanted it to idle. They wanted it to accelerate. And they wanted their big V8 to feel powerful. That last part mattered more than Chrysler probably realized, because the 440 had an identity. You could hear it. You could feel it. You could bury your foot in the throttle and feel hundreds of pound-feet of torque move a 2-ton automobile forward. That deep rumble at idle. That surge of acceleration when you open the throttle. That feeling that you were driving something substantial, something serious, something American. Now that same legendary displacement was being used as part of an emissions strategy. The badge still said 440, but the world underneath it had changed. And that's why 1974 matters. Not because every 1974 440 had lean burn. It didn't. The electronic lean burn system arrived later, beginning with the 1976 model year. Chrysler's own documentation and EPA reports make that timeline clear. 1974 was the warning shot. It was the moment when the old muscle car formula was visibly running out of road. The 440 still had the displacement. It still had the giant bore. It still had the long 3.75-inch stroke. It still had that unmistakable big block architecture. But the high compression era was ending. And once the lean burn system arrived, Chrysler was attempting to solve the next problem electronically. That system eventually found its way onto 440 applications, and by the late 1970s, the big block was producing numbers that would have been unthinkable to muscle car enthusiasts only a few years earlier. One contemporary reference lists a 1977 lean burn 440 at roughly 195 horsepower, from 375 horsepower in the classic high-output era to roughly 195 in the later emissions era. That isn't a minor decline, it's almost a different engine personality entirely. And yet the iron block underneath it was still a 440, the same displacement that had once powered Super Bs and Roadrunners, the same architecture that had been legendary on the street, now making barely half the power. That is what makes the story so tragic. Chrysler didn't build a bad engine. It built one of America's great engines at exactly the wrong time. The 440 was born for an age of cheap fuel, high compression, big carburetors, and horsepower wars. An age when bigger was always better. When performance was the priority. When emissions regulations barely existed. Then the rules changed. Emissions regulations arrived. Fuel prices exploded. Insurance costs climbed. Compression dropped. Performance became harder to justify, and Chrysler turned to electronics because it needed a new way forward. The irony is that the technology eventually proved important. Electronic engine control would become the future, but in the 1970s, the transition was messy. The 440 became a symbol of that transition, a giant mechanical V8 trying to survive in an increasingly computerized world. So was the 1974 440 really Chrysler's deadliest engine mistake? Not exactly. The more accurate answer is more interesting. The mistake wasn't building the 440. The mistake was believing that the old big block formula could be preserved indefinitely while every outside force was changing around it. The lean burn system wasn't the death of the 440. It was one of the clearest signs that the old muscle car era was already dying, and the 440 was caught in the middle. Today, enthusiasts still hunt for the legendary high-performance versions. They rebuild them, they restore them, they bolt on modern ignition systems, they improve carburation, they bring the compression back, they install better heads, they upgrade the camshaft. They transform emissions-era 440s back into the monsters they were always meant to be. And sometimes, they take a later low-compression 440 and give it the personality Chrysler had been forced to take away. That's the final twist. The engine wasn't dead, the era was. The 1974 440 still had 440 cubic inches, a 4.32-inch bore, a 3.75-inch stroke, and enough torque to move a massive American car with authority. But the 8.2-to-1 compression ratio and emissions-era calibration showed just how far the industry had moved from the days when horsepower was king. And the lean burn system that followed was not simply a disaster. It was an early experiment in the electronic engine control technology that would eventually define the modern automobile. That's what makes this story so fascinating. Chrysler didn't kill the 440 with one terrible decision. It tried to save it. And in doing so, it turned one of America's most famous big blocks into a machine caught between two eras: the era of raw mechanical horsepower and the era of the computer-controlled engine.